As I've said quite a few times already on this channel, Roblox horror is a genre that has existed for a very, very long time, with every 2 or 3 years or so marking some sort of notable trend in that space. And while I could name quite a few off the top of my head, none are more well-known or more controversial than the subject of today's video: story games. But what are story games? How did they become so incredibly popular between 2018 and 2020, and how did they decline to the state of basically being extinct now? Well, strap in, friends, and be sure to like and subscribe, because today we will be venturing down the rabbit hole of Roblox story games. Now, before we begin, I feel it's important to establish what I mean when I say Roblox story game, because it's a very vague title that seems to apply to anything from Get a Snack at 4 AM, to Arcane Odyssey, to Super Paper Roblox. But when I, and usually others, refer to a game as a story game here on Roblox, we usually typically mean a game that is intentionally or satirically designed around a simple, innocent premise that quickly devolves into a horror or mystery experience, with the gameplay being exploring a small area, surviving various challenges, and doing miniature obby sections, among other things. In this video, I will be talking about the original story game, quote-unquote, their rise to popularity, and finally, how and why these games died out. So without further ado, let's jump into it. Camping. It's crazy to think that this game is 5 years old by now. Really makes me feel old. Anyways, Camping and the subsequent sequels that followed it are a series of Roblox story games created by Samson XVI. The first game was created in 2018, and despite its simplistic nature, it not only spawned a huge fanbase, but also an entire genre of games that would be on Roblox for about 2 years. The game took off in part because nothing like it had ever been done before. Bait-and-switch horror games weren't really a thing on Roblox before Camping, and that's what a lot of people liked about it. But it wasn't just normal people. Roblox YouTubers, especially Dennis Daly, ate this game up. And I mean that in the most literal sense possible. I mean, have you seen how many he made on this?
What the fuck?!
And I think it's this attention from who was at the time the biggest, most popular Roblox YouTuber was partially, if not entirely, the thing that inspired the clones. Camping and its sequels were really the trendsetters for what story game tropes would be. For example, Camping 2 introduced the concept of multiple endings, and suddenly every single one of these games had multiple endings. Hotel ended with a boss battle, and suddenly all of these games ended with elaborate boss encounters. Finally, Mansion introduced the concept of the killer being the main guide of the story, and then every one of these games suddenly had twist villains. Camping was both the trailblazer and the trendsetter, and combined with the fact that the overarching story was not super complex or anything, but at the same time was delivered in a tasteful way as to keep its audience in the loop. It's no wonder why the Camping series took off the way it did. But looking back at the games now, they've all died, so even if these games were so well liked, how did this happen? Well, let's move on to the next section of the video to find out. Like I alluded to in the previous segment, a big reason why many of these games were created was for the fame of being played by popular YouTubers like Dennis Daly, LinkyBox, and others. And since Dennis and other YouTubers would literally play any of these things, more and more just got made. Now, unlike Samson, who clearly had a passion for making these games, most of these devs kinda just were only in it for the money. So once the honeymoon phase wore off and the hype died down, these games were mostly left to be abandoned. And when Roblox YouTubers finally moved away from these type of games, they naturally just kinda died. But that's not the only reason why story games just fell off the face of the earth. And it doesn't explain why Roblox YouTubers stopped playing these games. So why did they? Well, let's face it. These games have the most predictable and stale formula I have ever seen. They usually rely on one or a handful of gimmicks as quote-unquote hooks, such as the seemingly innocent premise and the start of the games, but gradually devolves into meaningless nonsense that has the most bland and unfair gameplay known to man, all as a guise to try and trick 5-year-old kids into playing longer. The whole thing that made these games work in the first place was that you weren't even supposed to be expecting the spooky aspects. But this genre eventually became so oversaturated that even the infants that play these games got bored of them, because they could just expect the twist. That's why in the later years of the genre, games like Jolly's Carnival either fully lean into the horror aspect and don't pretend to not be a scary game, or games like Field Trip Z or Break-In ditch the horror aspect entirely to focus on gameplay, which is why I think these games in particular stand out from the crowd as decently good games. This leads to my final point of this argument. These games are not replayable at all. They are designed to be played once or twice to get the endings, and then never again. Even the original Camping series suffers from this, which is why I think that whole thing is dead as well now. Not a huge thing on its own, but I hope that, with all these factors working against them, you can now see why these games died. But despite that, there's still one final nail in the coffin. One final thing that not only killed these games, but buried them 6 feet under. And its name is... If being super formulaic, being rip-offs of each other, and being extremely unreplayable weren't anything spelling doom for this genre of Roblox game, then Piggy was the literal public execution. Piggy was a game that was much more replayable, was a spoof of 2 already popular media IPs, and had a much more interesting story, and got very frequent updates. Pretty much everything that story games are. On top of all that, Piggy started its own trend of clones, but none of these really took off the same way the story games did. And in fact, this speaks to a change in the culture of Roblox after story games got fizzled out. Thinking about the popular Roblox horror games, Piggy, The Mimic, and Doors, they all have their fair share of clones and ripoffs, but none of them have risen to the same point of popularity as the story games did. I don't quite know why, but it's probably due to the stuff that I listed about story games earlier. Roblox's audience is aging up, and the games are progressively getting more and more professional to match. And I think the story games represent the last time Roblox horror was truly just a Roblox phenomenon for little kids. Because after that, things started to get more mainstream, the games got more impressive, and the scares actually real. And that's where I think I'm going to end things off. If you've enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you all next time.